They are among the most fierce and dangerous creatures ever devised by the Dark Lord Morgoth. While the most famous of their kind would appear in Bilbo's Third Age adventure, the greatest and most vile would live and die far earlier. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the dragons of Middle-earth. We don't know the exact year Morgoth began creating the dragons, but we do know the reason. In the early wars of the First Age, the Noldor dealt great blows against the Dark Lord in war. In the midst of a 400-year siege of Angband, where the Noldor held Morgoth in check within his fortress, he realized orcs alone would not win him victory in battle. Thus, Morgoth creates the very first dragon, Glaurung. The father of dragons was not a winged creature like his later relatives. In fact, all the initial dragons of Morgoth's design were land-bound. In 260 of the First Age, in the middle of the siege, Glaurung reveals himself for the first time, against the wishes of his master. He emerges from Angband and manages a small victory, despite still being young and not yet grown to full strength. He pushes the Noldor from Ardgalan and causes them to retreat to Dorthonion and the arid Wethrin. He begins to defile Ardgalan in his victory, but it would not last. Fingon, along with a company of mounted archers, comes to Glaurung and humbles the Great Worm, causing him to retreat back to Angband. Morgoth is displeased that his secret weapon had revealed himself prematurely, and would not allow the dragon to leave the fortress for nearly 200 years. Finally, in 455, Glaurung is fully grown, and is unleashed upon the elves. Glaurung leads Morgoth's largest army of Balrogs and orcs assembled to date, utterly burning the lands of Ardgalan, creating a charred desert known afterward as Anfauglith. 17 years later, the Free Peoples would strike back against Morgoth. The Union of Maithros, consisting of armies in both the east and the west, marches against Angband. On the third morning of this battle, Glaurung and his dragons enter the fight, in Morgoth's last effort to defeat his enemies. The strength and terror of the Great Worm were now great indeed, and elves and men withered before him, and he came between the hosts of Maithros and Fingon, and swept them apart. The elves divided, Glaurung battles in the eastern portion of the conflict, where he would have destroyed the Noldor, were it not for the dwarves of Belegost, led by Lord Azaghal. The dwarves, with their great battle masks, were able to withstand the dragon fire, and Glaurung's skin was not so tough that it was impenetrable. The dwarves hewed at the dragon with their axes, and Glaurung, driven into a rage, tramples Azaghal. Yet with his last breath, Azaghal drives a knife into the belly of the dragon. Glaurung flees from the battle, yet the battle was already won. The forces of elves, men, and dwarves would have catastrophic casualties in what would come to be known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. It wouldn't be until 40 years later that Glaurung would once again be put to use by Morgoth. By 495, Morgoth controls nearly the entire north of Beleriand, and there are few who openly oppose him. One such realm is Nargothrond, where King Orodreth is convinced to act in open hostility by his advisor, Turin, son of Hurin. Finally, after a number of attacks on his forces, Morgoth sends Glaurung and an army of orcs to Nargothrond. In another ill-advised move, Turin and Orodreth ride out to meet their enemy in the Battle of Tumhalad. The elves are crushed, Orodreth is slain, and Turin is unable to reach the city before the Great Dragon. Glaurung passes over the bridge, crosses the river Narog, and destroys the doors of the city. In this moment, we learn of another power of Glaurung, the power of his words and his gaze. Turin arrives at Nargothrond to find the city sacked, and as he goes to confront the dragon, he is transfixed by Glaurung's gaze, which freezes him where he stands. The captives of Nargothrond are led past Turin, and the dragon presents him with a choice: to pursue the captives and rescue the elf princess Finduilas, or return to Dorlomin and rescue his mother and sister, who are living in misery and servitude. Then suddenly Glaurung withdrew his glance and waited, and Turin stirred slowly as one waking from a hideous dream. Then coming to himself with a loud cry, he sprang upon the dragon, but Glaurung laughed, saying,
"If you wish to be slain, I will slay you gladly. But small help will that be to Morwen and Nienor. No heed did you give to the cries of the elf woman. Will you deny also the bond of your blood?"
But Turin, drawing back his sword, stabbed at his eyes, and Glaurung, coiling back, swiftly towered above him, and said,
"Nay, at least you are valiant, beyond all whom I have met. And they lie who say that we of our part do not honor the valor of foes. See now, I offer you freedom. Go to your kin if you can. Get you gone. And if elf or man be left to make tale of these days, then surely in scorn they will name you, if you spurn this gift."
Then Turin, being yet bemused by the eyes of the dragon, as if he were treating with a foe that could know pity, believed the words of Glaurung, and turning away he sped over the bridge. But as he went, Glaurung spoke behind him, saying in a fell voice,
"Haste you now, son of Hurin, to Dorlomin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before you once again. And if you tarry for Finduilas, then never shall you see Morwen or Nienor again, and they will curse you."
As Turin turns north to Dorlomin, the dragon laughs once again in his malice. For Turin has fallen for the dragon's lie. For his mother and sister had left long ago, and now dwell safely in Doriath. Glaurung drives away the orcs, denying them further plunder, and breaks the bridge. He lies down to sleep on his great hoard, in much the same way as his later descendants. The following year, Glaurung encounters Morwen and Nienor as they come to Nargothrond seeking news of Turin. Quickly detecting their approach, he lies in the river, causing a great steam and stench to cover the area. The women and their elf guard are separated, and Nienor comes face to face with the dragon, who also puts her under his spell. In this case, however, Glaurung uses his power to wipe Nienor's mind of all her memory, leaving her to flee into the wild. As Glaurung returns to his conquered city, he detects the presence of Mablung, one of the elves accompanying Nienor and Morwen. In this moment, we realize there is a deep connection between dragon and master, as he speaks with the very voice of Morgoth. But he turned before he went in and looked back eastward, and there came from him the laughter of Morgoth, dim but horrible, as an echo of malice out of the black depths far away. And this voice, cold and low, came after. "There you lie like a vole under the bank, Mablung the mighty. Ill do you run the errands of Thingol. Haste you now to the hill, and see what is become of your charge." Glaurung would rule Nargothrond as a dragon king for the next few years. By 498, he begins to send parties of orcs to attack the mannish realm of Brethil, which forces Turin to reveal himself once more. The following year, Glaurung sets out to face his mighty foe himself. However, Turin predicts the dragon's path, and taking inspiration from Lord Azaghal before him, Turin hides out in the gorge of Kabed and Aras, So as the great serpent casts his front legs across the ravine, Turin stabs him with his sword, Gurthang, all the way to the hilt. Even in his final moments, Glaurung is dangerous and cunning. As Turin pulls the sword from the dragon, its blood covers his arm and renders Turin unconscious. Later, Turin's wife, Niniel, comes upon the scene to discover her husband apparently dead. With his last breath, Glaurung reveals his ultimate deception, that Niniel is in fact Turin's sister Nienor, and gives her back her memory. In despair at the truth and the loss of her twice-beloved Turin, Nienor casts herself from the brink and is lost to the river far below. Turin, waking at the death of the dragon, discovers the truth for himself from another who had heard Glaurung's last words, and casts himself upon his own sword. With Glaurung dead, Morgoth had suffered a great loss. However, his first dragon would not be his greatest. Other dragons, known as Glaurung's brood, either by parentage or simply others of the same species, would wreak havoc in further wars and battles. Just 11 years after Glaurung's death, Morgoth would launch an attack on the last great hope of the Noldor, for he had finally discovered the location of the hidden city of Gondolin. He sends an army of orcs, balrogs, and dragons, and catches the elves by surprise. The city and much of its population is destroyed. While we don't know how many dragons there were, we are told they were many and terrible. Aside from Glaurung, we know the names of only 2 other dragons of the First Age. One is Gostir, of whom we only know its name, which means Dread Glance. The other would not be revealed until the War of Wrath, which begins in the year 545. Finally deciding to move against Morgoth, the Valar send the host of Valinor to Middle-earth, where a massive force of elves, men, Maiar, and possibly even some Valar, make war upon an uncountable force of orcs, along with the Balrogs of Morgoth. This war would last for 40 years. In the final years of the conflict, facing the defeat of his forces, Morgoth unleashes his last and greatest weapon, the winged dragons, never before seen in Middle-earth. The host of Valinor is caught by surprise, overwhelmed by the sheer devastation of the flying fire drakes of Angband. The dragons are led by Ancalagon the Black, the largest and most powerful dragon in the history of the world. The skies erupt with lightning and flame as the dragons push back the army of Valinor. Just as it appears that Ancalagon and his winged dragons will bring ultimate victory to Morgoth, help comes from the skies. Earendil, the father of Elrond and Elros, arrives in his ship, blessed with the power of flight by the Valar. Alongside him are the great eagles of the First Age, led by Thorondor. The aerial battle lasts for an entire day. In the end, Earendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky. And he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Thus ended the greatest of the flying dragons, and with him the hope of Morgoth's victory. The host of Valinor retakes their lost ground and more, destroying the majority of Morgoth's army. The Dark Lord would be captured and thrust through the Door of Night, and the few remnants of his army were scattered, including orcs, Sauron, a lone Balrog, and some dragons. The dragons would flee to the northern waste, far from any lands of men and elves. There they would live on, infesting and breeding in the area known as the Withered Heath, from which would come future great dragons that would plague the dwarves of the Third Age. Dragons like Smaug.
As for the Second Age, we are given no specific events or battles involving the dragons. However, we do know that they posed a serious threat during this period of over 3,400 years. For in the Silmarillion, we read of the men who were not among the Edain of the First Age, and men dwelt in darkness, and they were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion, demons, and dragons, and misshapen beasts, and the unclean orcs that are mockeries of the children of Iluvatar. And the lot of men was unhappy. But it was not only the men that would be plagued by these foul creatures of Morgoth, for in the Third Age we would see the dwarves repeatedly become victims of the Urulokki, or fire drakes, as well as the cold drakes of the north.
While we know Smaug would sack Erebor in 2770 of the Third Age, we're going to go back further to find the most likely origin for this chiefest of calamities. After Morgoth is defeated at the end of the First Age, there are still many of his dragons left in Middle-earth, not to mention one Balrog that we know of. And it's with this Balrog where we begin today's story. In 1980 of the Third Age, the Balrog is awakened by the dwarves of Moria under King Durin VI. This leads to Durin's death and the abandonment of Moria by the dwarves. Driven from their home, a contingent of Durin's folk under King Thrain I establish Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain, in 1999. Most of Durin's folk, however, would come to dwell in the Grey Mountains, to the northwest of Erebor. One of the few documented stories about a specific dragon comes in the following year when Skatha the Worm, who had captured treasure from the dwarves of the Grey Mountains, is slain by Fram of the Eothade people, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. You can learn more about these men in my video on the Eothade. Over 200 years after the Lonely Mountain is established, King Thorin I abandons Erebor in 2210, so that he and his people can rejoin the rest of Durin's folk in the Grey Mountains. There they would live in relative peace until the year 2570. Over the years preceding this, the dragons of the north had multiplied and become a mighty force. In 2570, they make war on the dwarves of the Grey Mountains and begin plundering the halls of Durin's folk. Impressively, the dwarves hold their own for 19 years, but in 2589, the dragons come to the halls of King Dane I. The king, his son Fror, and likely many others were slain in the attack. The father and son are killed outside the halls of the king by a cold drake, a name for a dragon that cannot breathe fire. After this final blow in the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, the dwarves of the Grey Mountains abandon their home. With the death of King Dane I, the kingship passes to his son Thror, the grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield. Thror leads his people back to the Lonely Mountain, re-establishing the kingdom of Erebor. Gror, who is the king's youngest brother, leads a group of Durin's folk to the Iron Hills, where they create another settlement. Gror is the grandfather of Dane II, also known as Ironfoot, who would later succeed his cousin Thorin as king under the mountain. It's important to note that we don't know whether Smaug was involved in this conflict in the Grey Mountains. Both Smaug and Gandalf refer to him being young when he comes to Erebor in 2770, but old and strong when Bilbo comes there in 2941. So it's entirely possible that he was either too young to partake in the war, or not even born yet when the war ended in 2589. With the War of the Dwarves and Dragons now over, the dwarves of Erebor would once again have a period of peace, this time for around 180 years. During this time, the kingdom under the mountain flourishes. However, their old enemy would return, in the form of the greatest dragon of the Third Age, Smaug. Like many others, Smaug hears of the tremendous wealth of Erebor, and in 2770, he flies south and sacks the kingdom under the mountain. Tolkien describes Smaug's flight to be like a hurricane. He attacks at night, catching both the dwarves and the men of Dale off guard. It is said that he first lands on the mountain itself before flying down to the woods around Erebor and setting them ablaze. The dwarven warriors come out of the front gate to fight the dragon, but are all killed. Smaug then turns his attention to the warriors of Dale, killing most of them, including Lord Girion, the ancestor of Bard. The dragon then returns to the mountain, slaying more of the dwarves and entering through the front gate. King Thror and his son Thrain II survived the attack by escaping through the secret back door. Thorin, who was just 24 years old at the time, was one of the few dwarves who wasn't inside the mountain during the attack, and manages to escape as well. Smaug takes the mountain and the treasure within for his own. In the aftermath, the area of Erebor and Dale, which had been scorched by the dragon, comes to be known as the Desolation of Smaug. Durin's folk, once again forced from their home, are left to their exile, eventually coming to Dunland, where they would live for a time before the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, culminating in the Battle of Azanabalzar in 2799. 3 years later, in 2802, Thrain, now king of his people, settles in the Blue Mountains west of the Shire. For over 170 years, Smaug dwells with his treasure hoard, leaving only occasionally, presumably to hunt for food. We know that he would exit through the Great Gate by night and come to Dale and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale is ruined and all the people either dead or gone. Smaug broods upon his treasure for a total of 171 years. This causes a phenomenon known as dragon sickness to come upon the treasure. This is a somewhat mysterious condition, as we really only know it is put upon gold on which a dragon has long brooded. Looking back at our earlier tale of Fram of the Eotheid, who killed the dragon Skatha, he refused to part with any of the treasure, despite the fact that this treasure likely belonged to the dwarves of the Grey Mountains before being taken by the dragon. It is believed that Fram was killed by the dwarves for this offense. Now, if you're curious what the dwarves did during this time that Smaug broods upon his treasure, check out my video on Thorin Oakenshield. We next hear of Smaug when Bilbo Baggins makes his way into the depths of Erebor in October 2941. After Bilbo steals a cup on October 22nd, Smaug takes notice. In The Hobbit, it says, "Dragons may not have real use for all their wealth, but they know it to an ounce as a rule, especially after long possession. And Smaug was no exception." This angers the dragon, who leaves his chamber and searches the mountainside for the culprit. He doesn't find Bilbo or the dwarves, but does manage to find their ponies. The next day, Bilbo returns to Smaug's lair, where they have their famous conversation.
Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along. Help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare.
But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come nearer so easily, he was disappointed. "No thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you and see if you were truly as great as the tales say. I did not believe them."
Do you now?
Said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. "Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities," replied Bilbo.
You have nice manners for a thief and a liar, said the dragon. You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from, may I ask?
You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led. And through the air I am he that walks unseen.
So I can well believe,
said Smaug.
But that is hardly your usual name.
I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number.
Lovely titles,
sneered the dragon.
But lucky numbers don't always come off.
I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I come from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me.
These don't sound so creditable,
scoffed Smaug. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer. I am barrel rider, went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling.
That's better,
said Smaug.
But don't let your imagination run away with you.
This, of course, is the way to talk to dragons if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise. and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring. But he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside.
I thought so last night,
He smiled to himself.
Lakemen. Some nasty scheme of those miserable tub-trading lakemen, or I'm a lizard. I haven't been down that way for an age and an age, but I will soon alter that. Very well, O Barrel Rider, he said aloud. Maybe Barrel was your pony's name, and maybe not, though I think it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you, I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Do not have more to do with dwarves than you can help.
Dwarves? Said Bilbo in a pretending surprise.
Don't talk to me,
said Smaug.
I know the smell and taste of dwarf, no one better. Don't tell me that I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief, barrel rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me.
But he did not tell Bilbo that there was one smell he could not make out at all, hobbit smell. It was quite outside his experience and puzzled him mightily.
I suppose you got a fair price for that cup last night?
He went on.
Come now, did you? Nothing at all. Well, that's just like them. And I suppose they are skulking outside, and your job is to do all the dangerous work and get what you can when I'm not looking for them? And you will get a fair share? Don't you believe it? If you get off alive, you will be lucky.
I tell you, he said, in an effort to remain loyal to his friends and to keep his end up, that gold was only an afterthought with us. We came over hill and under hill by wave and wind for revenge. Surely, O Smaug the unaccessibly wealthy, you must realize that your success has made you some bitter enemies. Then Smaug really did laugh, a devastating sound which shook Bilbo to the floor, while far up in the tunnel the dwarves huddled together and imagined that the hobbit had come to a sudden and a nasty end.
Revenge!
He snorted, and the light of his eyes lit the hall from floor to ceiling like scarlet lightning.
Revenge! The king under the mountain is dead, and where are his kin that dare seek revenge? Girion, Lord of Dale, is dead, and I have eaten his people like a wolf among sheep. And where are his sons that dare approach me? I kill where I wish, and none dare resist. I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Then I was but young and tender. Now I am old and strong, strong, strong. Thief in the shadows, he gloated. My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are swords. My claws spears. The shock of my tail a thunderbolt. My wings a hurricane, and my breath, death.
Smaug is enraged by the idea that they would dare attempt revenge upon him. Knowing that the men of Lake Town likely assisted this thief and his dwarf friends, he decides to destroy the town on the lake.
Barrel Rider, he snorted. Your feet came from the waterside, and up the water you came without a doubt. I don't know your smell, but if you are not one of those men of the lake, you had their help. They shall see me and remember who is the real king under the mountain.
He rose in fire and went away south towards the running river.
Smaug flies over the lake, avoiding the water so as not to quench his fire. He sets the town ablaze and destroys the great house with a swipe of his tail. As the destruction rages on, a thrush flies to Bard the bowman. Another result of Smaug laying on his treasure for so long is that his stomach possesses armor made of gold and gems, save for one bare spot. The thrush had overheard Bilbo telling the dwarves of the bare spot in Smaug's armor and relays this information to Bard. Bard fires his last arrow, the Black Arrow, which had been passed down from generations past, and hits the spot on the dragon's left breast. Smaug falls from the sky, destroying Esgaroth in his ruin. Smaug is slain, but his effects would be felt for days and years to come. Smaug's treasure would claim at least 2 more victims of dragon sickness. Thorin is the first, as he refuses to part with any of the treasure to help Bard and his people. The second comes after the events of The Hobbit. After Bilbo's back home, he learns from Gandalf and Balin that King Dain had given the Master of Lake Town some of the gold to rebuild what the dragon had destroyed. The Master instead takes the gold and flees into the Waste, a region north of the Lonely Mountain, where he would die of starvation. Despite the Master's treachery, Lake Town would indeed be rebuilt further north than before. Smaug's bones remained at the location of the former Lake Town. It is said that his bones could be seen from the shore, but that no one would dare go into the water to retrieve the gems that had lined his belly. Even in death, Smaug's very bones struck fear into the hearts of men.
While we don't know of any other dragons by name or by deed after Smaug's time, Gandalf implies that there are dragons still around after Smaug's death. In the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf reveals to Frodo that Bilbo's ring is in fact the One Ring, he states, "It has been said that dragonfire could melt and consume the rings of power, but there is not now any dragon left on earth in which the old fire is hot enough. Nor was there ever any dragon, not even Ancalagon the Black, who could have harmed the One Ring, the ruling ring, for that was made by Sauron himself." It's yet another fun thing to think about, the possibility of dragons being around after Smaug. While Sauron and Morgoth understandably get much of the attention as all-time great literary villains, I find Smaug and his kind to be worthy of mention as well. In fact, depending on the day, I would often choose Glaurung as my favorite Tolkien villain. Dragons are certainly a very common element of fantasy storytelling. But as with everything from the Professor, there is something truly special about the dragon characters he crafts. From the enormous Ancalagon, to the vile worm Glaurung, to the cunning fire drake Smaug, the dragons of Middle-earth are among the very best in history. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings.